Good morning. I'm George Bruno, your moderator for today. I served as the United States Ambassador in Latin America, appointed by President Bill Clinton, and I've been practicing global immigration law based in Manchester for the last 20 years. Welcome to the Monadnock Summer Lyceum with today's guest speaker, Maggie Fogarty. Before we start, I'd like to thank our musician, Jose Lescano, for providing the music you enjoyed while waiting for the program to begin. And Jose, I think I detected a Latino theme, and so we thank you for that. Very good. Also, thank you to the Monadnock FICA Group for sponsoring today's events. The management has asked me to remind people during the presentation to please wear masks. And so I noticed that everyone has a mask, so thank you for that. For many years, the Monadnock Summer Lyceum has brought world-class speakers to this region to serve as catalysts to inform, engage, inspire, and active citizenry on local, national, and global issues. Today's talk is being recorded and will soon be available as a podcast and as a video on our website, monadnocklyceum.org. Programs are rebroadcast on WSMN at 1590 a.m. the following Sunday at 10 a.m. and on WUML 91.5 FM the following Wednesday and at 11 a.m. the following Sunday. As is the tradition of the Lyceum, after the presentation, our speaker will answer questions from the audience. Those present in the meeting house may write your questions on the yellow card in the pew in front of you. An usher will come around to collect them. For those watching virtually, please submit your questions by using the live comment link on the Facebook or YouTube, or by emailing to monlyceum@gmail.com. The Monadnock Summer Lyceum is supported entirely through contributions from our audience. We deeply appreciate your donations, which may be placed in the glass bowls in the church and the parish hall. Those listening at home may make contributions on our website or by mailing in your donation. There is a green card in the pew pocket in front of you. Please use the green card to give us feedback. And by the way, if you're an immigrant, this will be the easiest green card you will have ever received. Please use the green card to give us feedback on today's program and for joining our mailing list. You can mail the card to us or drop it in one of the bowls along with your contribution to the Lyceum. For those watching virtually, please provide your feedback, suggestions for next year's speakers, for donation, or join our mailing list through our website. Following the program, we invite you to attend an informal reception in the parish hall. There you will have the opportunity to engage in further conversation with our speaker and enjoy refreshments. Now down to business. Our speaker today is Maggie Fogarty, and her talk is entitled Immigrant Justice Delayed, Human Rights Denied, Finding a Way Forward. Maggie is a community organizer. She graduated from Sweetbriar College and has a master's degree from Villanova University. She's married with 2 children and has resided in New Hampshire for the past 24 years. Maggie has also lived in Bolivia, speaks fluent Spanish, and has worked with the Marianal Order of Priests and Nuns to promote human rights among indigenous people. Maggie is the leader of the American Friends Service Committee in New Hampshire, part of whose universal goals are to promote justice, humane treatment, and uphold the dignity of immigrants, documented and undocumented, in New Hampshire and around the nation. Being a community organizer has many facets. It may include a neighborhood meeting, attending a vigil, organizing a rally, visiting and advising detainees at the federal lockup in Dover, participating in a sleep out, or conducting a protest in front of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Field Office in Manchester, sometimes known as ICE. But being a community organizer is more than protesting wrongful conditions. In fact, that's just a small part. Being an organizer means helping and empowering others. Maggie has done everything from finding host homes for those released from detention, raising funds to pay for bonds, conducting seminars on immigrant rights, negotiating with policymakers to secure driver's license for immigrants, and paying the legal expenses for persons arrested at rallies. Organizing is the hard work of advocacy, training, persuasion, networking, and attempting to lift up those less fortunate to find a place in American society. Finally, Maggie comes to us this morning just back from 10 days in Mexico City with the American Friends Service Committee leaders from all over the world discussing strategy, goals, and a global response to the important issues about the human condition. She might even have discussed, while she was there, the status of that proposed wall on the U.S.-Mexican border. So, please give Maggie Fogarty a warm New Hampshire welcome.
Thank you so much, George, for that wonderful introduction. And so many of the activities that you attribute to me conjure for me all of the partners, the organizations, the coalitions, the individuals with whom I get to do that work, who co-create that work. So I'm extra grateful for a chance to tell more of that story and invite people into that work together. So I am really grateful to be a part of this esteemed series, to be among good friends who are companions in this important work, and to offer my own perspective as a participant. And periodically this exercise of thinking about, oh, what can I say into this moment is a good occasion to really reflect on what has changed and where the openings are, and sadly, where the ongoing crisis is as well. So I come to this work as an activist, as an organizer, and as an advocate for humane immigration policy. More deeply, I come as a parent and a wife who understands at a visceral level that we can never abide policies that separate children from their parents, parents from their spouses, families from each other. I come to this work as a Quaker who believe that each of us are bearers of a divine light, and that obligates us to treat each other with love and care and dignity. And I come as a great-granddaughter of those who migrated to the United States from Ireland in the late 1800s, fleeing desperate poverty and with hope for a new world. And maybe before we continue, let's just take a moment, because we all have our stories. And this is an individual exercise, don't worry, I'm not gonna form you into groups, but just take a deep breath for a second. A colleague in Mexico reminded me in conversation, she said, we are the seeds that our ancestors cast into this world. We are their acts of hope for the future. So it reminds me that I don't think often enough about my ancestors or even my own particular path to this place. So just take a deep breath and think about one or more of your ancestors and what path they took that helped you to be here right now in this place. It helps us to remember that our stories are long and wide, and it helps us to recenter the humanity of those who are migrating now. I also come to this work of migrant justice as a white person who knows I have so much to unlearn and to learn, and so many ways that I need to recondition myself to do this work with humility and less certainty about the rightness of our systems or our assumptions and all of that. And so I believe that that work is done in a community of people who find the joy in the ongoing reflection and exercise of how do we dismantle oppressive systems doing better as we know better. And lastly, for now, I come to this work as someone who was welcomed by a community of indigenous people in Bolivia, as George mentioned, when my husband and I and our two then small children lived in Amachuma, an Aymara village of potato farmers just outside of El Alto, which was a sprawling city of 1 million people. We lived there from 2004 to 2007. And despite the fact that our neighbors there were very sophisticated and knew the dynamics of their history and knew what happened to Bolivian people when Catholic missionaries or people from the United States or people coming wanting to do good, they knew the harm that has caused them over centuries and that they're still living the legacy of that harm. And miraculously, or as a testament to their wisdom and love, they treated us with tremendous generosity and kindness. And they introduced us to a new to us, millennial to them, but a new way of being in the world, which they call the buen vivir, or vivir bien. And it's something more than to live well. It's about living in harmony with the earth, making decisions from a collective consciousness of well-being beyond that of the individual or a small circle of people. It's certainly a worldview that if we were listening better and for longer, would surely have prevented us from living in the multiplicity of crises that we are living in now as a world, including with our climate. And it was in Amachuma that I started to notice the pattern of young adults from the community who would move to Argentina and to Brazil to work in, mostly for them it was clothing factories there. And they'd come back a few years later and they'd be quiet and thin and weary. And they would share stories of being 23, 24 hours inside the warehouse where they worked, laboring for many, many hours a day, but then sleeping and taking their meals there. The tremendous pressure to repay the labor brokers who had bought their passports and their passage to those places. They talked about the quality of the air that made them sick. I also noticed from Bolivia that there were families whose loved ones had headed north, some more than 4,000 miles to the United States, and how the family worried and longed for them. So it was the beginning of an orientation. Late in my life, I should have been paying attention longer ago, but that's when it became real for me. And it was also from Bolivia that I watched what was happening here in 2006 as immigrant workers, documented and undocumented, janitors, restaurant workers, warehouse workers, nannies, extracted their labor from our economy for a day without an immigrant. And they did this on May 1. I see some nods. It was a powerful thing to see. Many hundreds of thousands, some say even more than 1 million people in cities around the country. Many of them had everything to lose, but insisting on their dignity, insisting on fair treatment, and in opposition at that point it was to a Sensenbrenner bill that had just passed the House that would have enacted more restrictions, more punitive immigration policies. So they demonstrated to us the essential nature of their contribution, not just to our economy, but to our whole lives. And I also saw from Amachuma, Bolivia, the tremendous backlash to that demonstration of power and dignity. It was immediate. There was a Minuteman vigilante parade the very next day after that May Day rally. So frightening was this image of people who were claiming their right to be here. And then, of course, the George W. Bush administration responded as well with more raids meant to terrify the community and to keep people in their place, which thankfully they have refused to do. So I began working for the American Friends Service Committee within 2 months of returning to the US, and thank God, because my unquiet soul and my longing to be a part of something meaningful and global needed to be met. And I frankly hadn't been aware of the AFSC before I left. And so it was a wonderful surprise to find out that despite having been here for a long time, there was a whole bunch of wonderful movement and action that was happening unbeknownst to me. And as you may know, the AFSC was founded, it's a Quaker-founded organization. It was born in 1917 when Quaker men in the United States and in Britain, because of their commitment to pacifism, refused to enlist in the armed forces, but they wanted to be of service to the humanitarian crisis happening in Europe during the war. So they organized into service committees. They managed ambulance brigades and all manner of accompaniment for people who were internally displaced, but also refugees, regardless of what side they were on or what country they were from. And so in that way, accompaniment and advocacy for refugees, migrants, displaced people has been a part of our worldview and our priorities from the very beginning. And so over these 105 years of practice and true to Quaker principles, the AFSC believes that migration is a fundamental human right. It is a universal behavior. It has happened throughout time. It happens for love, for adventure. It happens to save people's lives, to find safety, to find well-being. And as such, we need policies that ensure that people can migrate where they want, when they want, and that they can do so safely and with dignity. We also understand migration to be forced very often, forced by capitalism, neoliberalism, militarism, other forms of violence, and in recent decades, forced by the climate crisis that has destroyed people's livelihoods and made some land simply unlivable. Exploitative free trade agreements, extractive industries that make a curse of having water under your soil, or silver a long time ago, or gas under your soil, that leave people with no ways of caring for themselves or living in a healthy way. The gun violence, the corruption between local police and the military and governments, the narco violence that is a plague in our southern hemisphere, fueled by, not diminished by, the US war on drugs and the steady flow of weapons that we send to countries that we know have a corrupt relationship with the cartels. And I have to mention that many of these guns come from New Hampshire's Sig Sauer, and there have been human rights cases trying to lift up the narrative that Sig Sauer's weapons end up in the hands of those who then kill Mexican people. So people migrate for the most fundamental of reasons, as I say. And in many cases, they're migrating because their loved ones are already here. We no longer have a system that allows people to move back and forth as they wish. So people get trapped here on this side of the border, and then children or spouses or others need to try to cross that border in order to be together. We know that it's a global phenomenon. Now in the world, there are more refugees and internally displaced people than there have been since World War II. And tragically, the US and other nations are responding with more punitive, more restrictive policies. So we're in a full-blown human rights crisis that is rooted in our own country's history of racism and criminalization and economic exploitation, although those dynamics aren't limited to the United States, but we're certainly an engine for this crisis. And we wrap it in a narrative of US exceptionalism and xenophobia. So it's quite a beast that we have to contend with here. And I want to say a little bit about how this is a bipartisan catastrophe. Unfortunately, we can't just say, oh, well, we'll just elect, this group of the right people and then all will be well. This has built steadily over more than 100 years with policies that the impacts we still feel today. So there's a lot to be said about how racism and exploitation is part of the origin story of our country. And thankfully, primarily through indigenous leadership, including indigenous leadership here in New Hampshire, we are starting to wrestle with that more explicitly, about who was on the land before the European settlers arrived. What might reparation for those harms actually look like? We're at the beginning stages of imagining a more right relationship. And then, of course, African American community members, making sure that we probe deeply and defend the right to teach an accurate history of the enslavement of people in the United States. So there's a lot that we know, there's a lot still to be known. I want to just flag one book that's been helpful to me in understanding the racialized border policies that we have in the United States. It's called White Borders by Rhys Jones. And it starts at the beginning, that we didn't have border laws until about 1875. But then in the 19th century, we start to enact border policies to preserve what Rhys calls the illusion that the US is a white country. And everything kind of builds from there. So I know this is a very educated audience. You know that in 1882, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese immigrant laborers from coming to the US for 10 years. You know that we treated the Japanese to internment after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, so in the 1940s, which made very clear that who was truly American and who was to be mistrusted. And that same year, we reached an accord with Mexico for the Bracero program to meet the labor shortage needs of American employers, because then they could receive low-cost labor from Mexico. And then that program was ended in the 60s. But I want to hit a few more recent chunks of how this machinery for detention and deportation and human rights violations got built. And then we're going to talk about where the hope is, where the movement is, and how we can keep connecting and expanding our imagination for immigration justice. But I don't want to skip over this because we're not taught it in school. And immigration policy is complicated, and maybe it's designed to be so. So it helps us to know the current crisis we're in is built by policy. It is built by policy. It is funded by our tax dollars. So one of the more recent pieces of good news in immigration policy, the credit goes to Ronald Reagan, who in 1986 signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And what passed through that was an opportunity for legalization for nearly 3 million people. We have not had since then such a substantial scale of opportunity for legalization for undocumented people. We almost did. We were heading there recently with the Build Back Better, but we know where that ended up. President Clinton's legacy is an ominous one. He signed in 1996 the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. It made more people deportable and less people legalizable. And it intensifies this criminalization of migration. And it expands the categories of immigrants who can be removed without ever getting a hearing before a judge. So the narrative of criminal migration is so persistent, and we're going to talk about that later. It's been fueled along the way. It's been kind of injected with greater urgency as some leaders are opportunistic in service to their more xenophobic ideas. But it persists through multiple administrations and in the narratives of regular people. So when George W. Bush is president, of course, we have the terror attacks of 9/11, which bring on the Patriot Act and all sorts of added dollars for surveillance, restrictions on civil liberties, and this criminalization of the other is accelerated as well. It's also the time when the Department of Homeland Security is created, which is where Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection live. These are the main bodies that enact the detention and deportation of immigrants here. They're getting about, we're going to talk about this later, but they're getting about $25 billion of our tax dollars. And with the CBP in particular, a dramatic legacy of harm, of rights violations, and impunity. Also, what happens during George W. Bush is something called NSEERS, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System. It required all immigrants here from Muslim and Arab countries to register with the federal government. So blatant Islamophobia on display, codified in policy. And that was the federal policy that caused a lot of hardship for the Indonesian community in the seacoast of New Hampshire. You may know their story in general. It got good coverage for a time because they were in a particularly acute situation, but they came to New Hampshire in the late 90s fleeing persecution because of there was Muslim extremism in their country, and the Muslim government did not seem to be taking sufficient action to protect the safety of non-Muslims. And even Muslim people were being negatively harmed by the actions of these extremists. So they came here on temporary visas, visitor visas, et cetera, just wanting the respite to discern when would they be able to go back. And time passed and the situation was getting worse, not better. And so pretty soon they've overstayed and they haven't yet applied for asylum. And there's a deadline for applying for asylum. So horrible shock across the community as people found themselves out of status with no immediate way to correct that. So then here comes NSEERS, and wanting very much to obey the laws of the United States, these folks registered with the government, and that's what revealed their status. And they were then put into a very long limbo period under the Obama administration of orders of supervision. Well, it probably started sooner, but orders of supervision, which meant they had to keep checking in with ICE, never knowing if the other shoe was going to drop, which certainly under the Trump administration it did. I'm going to move quickly through this, but also under George Bush, we had Operation Streamline and expedited removal, all designed to say, how quickly can we scoop people up, deny them a hearing, or the ones who get a hearing, let's do groups of 30, 40 people all at once just to make it easier to deport them. And it's when we had the detention bed quota in the federal budget as well, that was put in 2004, which set a minimum number of immigrants to be in ICE detention on any given day. So that has a tremendous impact on contracts with private prisons, which then got into the billions of dollars. But again, fueled by policy. So then President Obama comes on board, and his record is really mixed. He tries to get a comprehensive bill through. It passes the Senate, but then it dies in the House. So one of his more positive contributions to immigrant justice was that as he was winding down his term, he created the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the DACA program, to try to give something to the dreamers. And we're going to talk later about how it was dreamers who won DACA. It was not a political decision. The dreamers made it impossible to ignore their stories and their right to be here. So we always have to give credit. Every major development in support of immigrant justice has been won by immigrants themselves, the ones with the most to lose. But President Obama really pays a lot of attention to turning people back at the border. And that's why his numbers were so high in the millions that it made him the deporter-in-chief, was what he was called, and it was true. And he also pressured Mexico to participate in a border security program such that my AFSC colleagues in Latin America and Central America say the US border doesn't end at the US-Mexico border, it ends at the Mexican-Guatemalan border, because the US has been so effective in stretching our will, our policies of detention, of deterrence, of deportation further south. And none of this ever actually restricts the flow of people coming to this country. It just makes it more difficult, more risky, more dangerous. And it gives more power to smugglers and gangs, et cetera. So then all of that machinery that got built over those decades gets handed to the Trump administration with monstrous notions of what needs to happen with immigration policy. Absolutely monstrous, right from the beginning. the Muslim ban, the zero tolerance policies after they practiced it in 2017 and then did a full-blown launch in 2018, prosecuting every single parent that came across the border, separating their children. We all, I'm sure, are haunted by the images and the sounds that we were able to experience of that. 5,000 people separated through that policy by design. I want to recommend Caitlin Dickerson has a great extensive piece in The Atlantic, I think it's this month's, called We Need to Take the Children. And she talks about every single step along the way where this idea was approved and then enacted. And it was by design that the reunifications couldn't happen. It was planned that parents, when they were returned to a Border Patrol station, were taken to a different one than the one where they had been processed. It was by design that children were whisked away to foster care facilities in the middle of the country because they wanted the cruelty, they wanted the deterrence. So, we've got bad immigration policy on steroids, the creation of the migrant protection protocols that requires people to wait in Mexico while their cases are being adjudicated, a process that made pretty clear that people could not really get adequate representation for their cases. They were not in safe situations, and the numbers on that bear out. This is from December of 2020, when there were 42,000 MPP cases that had been completed, only 521 people were granted asylum, were granted any kind of relief. So it was designed not to work. And thankfully, the Biden administration said they were going to roll back that policy, tried to, the courts made them reinstate it, but now the Supreme Court says he has the authority to roll it back, and it is in fact being wound down. But it's unimaginable the human toll of that particular policy. And then Trump also, there's so many other things, but I just want to lift up that he enacted Title 42, which was this little-known CDC protocol that would deny entrance at the border due to public health concerns during the pandemic. And we're still living with the legacy of that. So Trump managed to do an awful lot with 472 executive actions. He didn't use Congress for much. He really couldn't have made the kinds of changes he made. I'm sure they wouldn't have passed the scrutiny of the Congress that he had, but it's going to be really hard to undo. We still haven't undone the extensive network of changes that he's made because a lot of them are in the courts. We have judges that have lifetime appointments and systems that are just full of people who were selected by Trump. And then we get to President Biden, who's got a mixed record too. So he did immediately end the Muslim ban. He is working to wind down MPP and to manage migration at the southern border. But the efforts to reunite families, there are still, Lee Gallant from the ACLU says there are still 1,000 families that haven't been reunited from the Trump-era policy. And the Biden administration has walked away from the negotiations where families were asking for financial compensation for their hardship. And while there's some limited avenues for reunited families to stay in the United States for a couple of years, what they really deserve from us, in addition to reparations, is a legalized pathway in the US. So there's more to be done there. And what I particularly want to lift up about the Biden administration is that their record when it comes to Black migrants is really shameful. I mean, the number of deportation flights to Haiti when we know the conditions in Haiti are unlivable. When we ourselves, if we know our history, we have contributed to the impoverishment and the violence and the uncertainty in Haiti. So seems to be no sense of obligation there. Haitians living in the same kinds of conditions that Ukrainian people have been living in, who were able to secure some legal presence in the United States very rapidly. And Cameroonian asylum seekers as well, detained at the southern border after that unbelievable trip. We have a friend in Durham who's been detained, he was detained for 2 years for seeking asylum, and now he's been out under house arrest for 2 years. So Black migrants are experiencing a particularly acute harm in this system, and the Biden administration is not sufficiently pushing back on that. So I encourage, and the funding for immigration, for ICE and CBP continues to go up. We have funding at Trump-era levels for these agencies when we're supposed to be living under a new administration. So if our budgets, if you believe, as I believe, that our budgets are moral documents, then we need to see drastic cuts to the funding for these agencies. And so as I came home from Bolivia and I thought, oh, how do you connect to this work in New Hampshire? I don't think it's here. I had no idea that within a few years I would be in relationship with people who are very much living the reality of this system that we have. One friend, I'll call her Paulina, asked for my help in writing her letter to the judge. She was serving a federal sentence for reentry, which is we've made it a federal felony to come back to the United States after you've been deported. She's come back 4 times. Her children are here. Her children are in Manchester. She made a really dumb mistake several years ago, really minor, please trust me, minor mistake. She was deported, but there was no way she was going to make her children come to where she lives there, which is very unsafe, and she wasn't going to be without them. So she asked for my help writing this letter, and just the sincerity of her appeal always moved me. She said, every time I left this country, it was because of a family emergency. When I say emergency, it truly was. In order to leave my children here and go to Mexico, it was always for urgent matters, not a pleasure trip, and never because I wanted to violate the laws of this country. As you know, Your Honor, the journey here is very costly, not only monetarily, but in terms of the great danger. She's begging for her life. She's begging to be understood. She did get deported again. So let us just honor for a moment the courage and the persistence of people who, for love, are fighting these extraordinary battles. A friend of mine is an Indonesian grandmother who was caught up in one of the CBP checkpoints that we had rather frequently here for a while in this state. She was with her grandkids visiting the White Mountains on a Sunday afternoon, and she was pulled over in the checkpoint and asked to show proof of legal presence in the U.S., which she did not have. She was part of that group I was describing, and she spent months at the county jail in Dover, fearing that she was going to be deported. And I got to know, also close to my home, about 13 Central American laborers, carpenters who were building luxury student housing at the University of New Hampshire, who after months of labor in freezing temperatures, they were framing up the buildings. They asked for their pay and they were told, get lost or I'll call ICE. So then they go to the Dover Police Department, because that's where they lived, reported the theft of their wages, and the Dover police called ICE. And there's a happy ending to that story because of this wonderful combination of capacities we have in New Hampshire, which I'm going to shift and talk about, which is there were immigrant leaders who heard their story. There were faith community members who said, this is not right. There were elected officials who said, eventually, let's sit down with the police and insist that this kind of treatment not happen again. There were good private and nonprofit lawyers who helped them to win their wages back, tens of thousands of wages. And now, because of some legal representation, they've got U visas for being victims of crime, and their families are here, etc. So all changes like this are made possible because a tremendous amount of infrastructure has been built up over many years. We have the New Hampshire Immigrant Rights Network, which looks at policy. It's where we come together to sharpen our analysis and think about how do we collaborate so that our voices are heard. We have the New Hampshire Immigrant Solidarity Network, which is convened by the Granite State Organizing Project, which has primarily been an entry point for faith leaders to say, how do we show up for this work? How do we offer? And that's turned into a number of sanctuary congregations. The Manchester UU Church, the Meriden UCC in the Upper Valley, my own Quaker Friends meeting, Dover Friends meeting. but also this whole network, including Project Home and others, of hospitality and accompaniment networks. And because of the bond funds that have been created and some of the commissary and telephone funds that have been created largely by the New Hampshire Conference of the United Church of Christ, then we've been able to help people to get out of detention in Dover and provide some supports. And our relationships with them deepen our commitment, deepen our understanding of what's at stake here. Mobilized residents of New Hampshire thwarted a lot of the CBP checkpoints. And those of you in the northern part of the state near Lancaster and also in the Upper Valley know that when you show up with signs, the next exit down, and warn people that CBP is coming up, then they can take an exit and avoid that dragnet. So there's lots of good news. I will say we have not yet been able to make champions of our congressional delegation. And maybe during the question time, we can talk a little bit about what they need to hear from us. They've been helpful here and there around the margins with some special requests. And Senator Shaheen, for example, supported TPS for Cameroon, which helped a couple of people here in New Hampshire. But they have not decided that this is an issue worth expending political capital. They're helpful at the constituent level. They are not trying to change the very system that is doing this harm. So there is that work to be done. And the last thing I'll say before I stop for right now is that we have an extraordinary and growing network of emerging and full-blown immigrant leadership. Throughout the country, Haitian Bridge Alliance, UndocuBlack, Baji, United We Dream, other organizations of dreamers, but also in New Hampshire. We have Black immigrants are organizing under a group called Umoku Umani, giving voice to their experiences and what they want for themselves here. We have the Indonesian community support. We have the New Hampshire Brazilian Council. So if we can position ourselves to be in service to their demands and their vision, then a lot more can be possible. And I think we will have more power. And the last thing, we're benefiting from this marvelous growth of leadership through the Black Lives Matter movement in New Hampshire, because there is such a ready understanding of the intersectionality of these issues. Immigration is a racial justice issue. And so there's just more and more people coming to this work, even if they're not directly impacted as immigrants, understanding the racial analysis and the need for racial justice. So on that note, I will just say I have a lot of hope for us, and there's plenty of work to do. So I want to welcome your questions. Thank you.
Maggie, thank you very much. Maggie, thank you very much for your insightful comments and thoughts on immigrant justice. We have some time for questions. For those watching virtually, you may submit questions by using the live comment link on Facebook or YouTube, or send them in via email at monlyceum@gmail.com. And so while the ushers collect the yellow cards with your questions, let me ask this one, Maggie. Here we are in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and if this were a legislative body rather than a packed audience in the Unitarian Universalist Church, what would you tell them, and what would you have them do by way of legislative reform if this was a legislature, either state or national?
Okay, that's one. Thank you so much for an easy setup. So right now I'm going to make you all Congress, okay? So Congress, we need a pathway to citizenship for every undocumented person in the United States. And we need to reject, please do not participate in the narrative of criminalization that sounds like we've all got amnesia about everything we've been learning about racialized policing and over-surveillance of communities of color and the impacts and unhelpful costs of mass incarceration. So reject the language of criminalization. If I'm talking to you Democrats, you're carrying it too, and it is not helpful. So reject that. Please ensure protections for workers in the United States so that undocumented workers are not as vulnerable to wage theft and other forms of exploitation. Ensure that the United States is honoring its obligations under international and U.S. law with regard to the rights of asylum seekers. Codify as much as you can so that it's not just temporary protections that go back and forth between one administration and the next. If you are state legislators, then I want to insist that you listen to the immigrant community members in New Hampshire who have been asking for, demanding the right to drive a car, the right to obtain a driver's license without yet having a social security number. Driving is driving. Let's make sure people understand the driving rules, pass a driving test. Let's make it possible for them to get car insurance. But driving should not be at all related to immigration, all right? And driving also has nothing to do with voting. So the kind of boogeyman of, oh, if we give people driver licenses, then they'll vote en masse. There are a whole bunch of people in New Hampshire who have a driver license who aren't eligible to vote. Our town clerks know how to do that. So New Hampshire State Legislature, when you come back, hopefully substantially different than you are right now, not you all, but our current one, then you will see your way to finishing. The House passed a bill legalizing, creating driver licenses for undocumented in 2019. And then the Senate, even though there was a Democratic majority there, they let it die. So let's get that done. Want me to go on?
That's good.
Okay.
Another person asked, don't we as a society need more immigrants in the United States, and how many?
Well, when my people came, there wasn't a big obstacle course for them, and that worked out really well for us. So I think that we should be expansive in our notion of who can come here. I think we know that we benefit from immigrants in our society. We benefit in so many ways, not just their labor. Let's not only see them as workers for our economy, for the jobs no one else wants to do, but let's consider it our way of living up to the ideas we have about who we are. And the other book I wanted to pitch was let's take steps to make sure that people have the right to stay home. So this is David Bacon's book. It's excellent, The Right to Stay Home, How U.S. Policy Drives Mexican Migration. There's a whole lot of learning we need to do about the impact of, as I mentioned, U.S. trade agreements, U.S. foreign and economic policy more broadly, U.S. militarization of local police in other countries, how that makes people's lives unlivable. We can act in ways that make it possible for people to stay home where they are rooted, where their loved ones are, where they have a connection to their land. And then it isn't just about how many we should let in here.
So I'm going to combine a couple of questions here and ask you this one. Are you suggesting that the United States should have an open border? Now, our laws in the United States pertaining to crossing the border, the criteria is asylum. That is, you have to be subject to persecution or threats of persecution. Are you suggesting that our asylum laws should be changed to include economic refugees?
I think we tell ourselves that we are a nation for everyone, where people can find safety and security and freedom, and we have a long way to go to live up to that. So I think we can keep living into a much fuller definition of who belongs here. Am I evading the question? I don't have a debate team answer to the open borders question, but I will say we've had different borders. I mean, as I mentioned, until 1875, we didn't have border policies per se. They are enacted with a racist intent. So let's just interrogate that before kind of just assuming that they're a justified structure. And we've had borders where people can come and go. They come as the work is here. They go home for seasons in their home country. They come to visit people. They go home for funerals. Like, that can work. We have products crossing borders every single second of every single day. So maybe we can treat people better than we treat, or even the same as we treat products. It's certainly worth a try.
What do you say to the claim that by allowing more immigrants in the United States that they are stealing our jobs?
Yeah, it's just not true. It's a pervasive story, but it's not true. And we're being played. It's that kind of white grievance. It's that scarcity bone that we have in us, that people can make us afraid. People can convince us that our problem is the undocumented guy washing the cars in downtown Dover, and not the core civic private prison company whose lobbyists won the detention bed quota in the federal budget, where it was for 13 years, driving billions of our tax dollars to those companies. Like, I think we need to redirect when we hear that and point to who's profiting off of these ankle monitors, who's profiting off of the border militarization, including the surveillance equipment. So I think I'd redirect when I was asked that.
Getting back to the open border concept, one person asked, would you impose any restrictions of people who are admitted to the United States?
So as a Quaker who believes in the inherent dignity and worth and divine light in every single person, I would say that that is above my pay grade to make those determinations.
Okay.
You're going to keep trying to trick me into...
Okay, we'll pivot to an easier question.
Okay, thank you. It's getting hot up here.
What and where is the immigrant community in New Hampshire? How large is it, and where is it?
Yeah, so I'm not a great one for the kind of macro view of numbers. Certainly our two refugee resettlement organizations, A Century of Care Alliance, which used to be Lutheran Social Services, and the International Institute of New England, which has a home here in New Hampshire, they can give you a lot of information about who's come through the refugee resettlement program, as well as the Afghan people coming now through the humanitarian parole program, who have been resettled through neighborhood support teams. Some of them have, others have been resettled more traditionally. So they'd have a set of the numbers. I imagine our census data would shed light on some. There's an Office of Health Equity in the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services. I know that they gather numbers. In terms of undocumented people, I've heard the number 15,000 given before, but for obvious reasons, it's really, I think our immigration attorneys can probably amass some data about what kinds of affirmative petitions people are filing or benefits they're seeking. But in terms of the aggregate, I mean, we are an immigrant state, right? Those of us who aren't indigenous to this land, or whose parents or ancestors weren't brought through enslavement, we have an immigration story. So whether it's the French Canadians or the Irish or the Germans or the Indians who have come in recent decades, it'd be a hard question to answer.
Can you shed any light on what prevents immigration reform and why it has been stalled for so many years?
So I think a lack of political will. I think that there's been a really flawed logic among Democrats that if you cede the ground on the border militarization stuff and the criminal exclusions, then somehow you'll win some big benefits for people, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. I mean, as I say, President Reagan deserves the thanks for the last major legalization in this country. So I don't know why we're tied to a strategy that's been disproved so many times. So, but I do take hope, as I was starting to say earlier, undocumented people and people with DACA, that Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, temporary protected status holders, TPS holders, asylum seekers at the border, the ones with everything to lose, are speaking the most unapologetically, the most unequivocally, the most authoritatively about what is so flawed. I won't say broken, because I think we can accept that it's been designed to work a certain way, but the flaws, the profound harm of our system. And so as their power continues to build, I think it will necessitate more courageous action by our elected officials. And then we have to make sure that we are electing folks who can hear those messages. And we have some immigrants in our state legislature, Representative Maria Perez, Representative Lata Manchaputi, Representative Jean Judy from Haiti. And so supporting them so that their voices are more heard is a way forward. And we need to take the profiteering out of immigrant detention and deportation. I think if we had some corporate campaigns that withdrew the billions of dollars, that we would more readily see a change in practice.
Our focus this morning, Maggie, has been on U.S. immigration policy. But as we look around the world, is there a model country that has an enlightened immigration policy?
That's a great...
I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Yes, yeah. There are some I would used to say were, but then with the treatment of the Syrian refugees, for example, then even some of the old standbys started to be convinced of a more punitive approach. I don't know the answer to that. It does become an occasion to say that because we know that migration is a global issue, I know I benefited a great deal in Mexico City last week with colleagues from Zimbabwe and Kenya and Jordan and Palestine and El Salvador and Guatemala and Mexico, thinking about what are some of the common themes, what are the ways certainly that the U.S. is replicating strategies with the pressure of foreign aid in other places, and what are some of the strategies in terms of, for example, elevating the voices of returned people, deported people when they're back in their home countries, to try to put some greater pressure on the international bodies, the United Nations, as well as other international human rights commissions, so that where there are good laws, they are enforced, and where there are bad laws, that they are undone. So there's plenty of work to be done globally, but I don't think I can point to an example of, oh, well, let's try and model ourselves off of them. If there is one, I'd love to hear from people.
If people want to join in your efforts to assist your work, how can they do that? And what activities or positions would be available for volunteerism?
Great. So that's the really good news in New Hampshire, is that there are so many ways to plug in. I mean, and then there's so many people, there's not even time to name them all, but I'm just seeing who's here. The Never Again Action and Portsmouth Lights for, Peterborough Lights for Liberty, the Kent Street Coalition, and the Canterbury Citizens for Democracy are, just actively always saying, where can we show up, where can we help out? The New Hampshire Council of Churches, as I mentioned, the New Hampshire Immigrant Solidarity Network meets monthly. The New Hampshire Immigrant Rights Network meets monthly. Those who are engaged in host homes and sanctuary homes meets monthly. There's a lot of monthly meetings. The Drive Safe campaign, which is going to try to win this driver license effort, will be reaching out for public support. Our members of Congress can always need to hear from us to, again, be braver, be champions, actually work to change the system using the power you do have. We don't want to hear about the power you don't have. That wasn't part of your campaign pitch. We are talking to you because you are elected to represent us. We want you to use the power you do have to change the system, not just to try to alleviate some of the impacts further downstream. So I would say a short answer is to please email me, mfogarty@afsc.org, and I will send you, we've got a whole sheet of contact information and websites for all of these various networks. And depending on where you live, there's surely something local.
Just a final thing, we have a very well-attended audience this morning, and I know Maggie would be very curious to know if you are involved in immigration advocacy or activities, would you raise your hand?
Yep, it's a good crew.
Okay, I think that speaks well of us and of New Hampshire, and for those who are not involved, there are plenty of opportunities. I want to thank you for your attendance today, and thank Maggie for her presentation. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of the Monadnock Lumber Summer Lyceum. Thank you for your support for the 2022 session. Please join us next week to hear Leslie Carhart on cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, the essentials. Now I'd like to invite you to join our speaker at a reception through the doors to my right, and thank you all.